Hello everyone, and welcome back for Chapter 17, Revolutions of Industrialization, 1750 to 1914. And we're going to start with explaining the Industrial Revolution. The transformations of the Industrial Revolution restructured the entire global economic and social order. Its repercussions are felt even today, and many different world history themes are linked to industrialism, ranging from the political reach of imperialism to the shifting notion of labor systems, and from the expanding systems of trade to the formation of entirely new class structures. Now, technology is a major factor in two of our AP World History themes. Think about your SPICE acronym, the interaction between humans and the environment, that would be intellectual history, or I, and the development and transformation of social structures, S. Now, when explaining the Industrial Revolution, look at new technologies and how they fundamentally change the relationship between people and their environment. You should also understand that new technologies represent cultural developments springing from the advances of the scientific revolution. Now, the effects of industrialism on social structures are especially important. Think about how both the demographic shifts, such as rural to urban migration, and changing gender roles resulted from this new factory system. Now, this chapter provides special emphasis on changes within the aristocracy, the emergent middle classes, and the laboring classes. Industrialism also influenced the rise of sophisticated financial structures. The development of laissez-faire capitalism and the theories of economics advocated by Adam Smith proved to be instrumental in the creation of new financial institutions. Intellectual criticism of the new structures of capitalism also emerged, which in turn inspired movements that have transformed the modern world. Now, tracing the intellectual causes and effects of industrial capitalism can help you guys gain a greater sense of the broader interpretations of history. And since the AP World History course focuses on the interactions between humans and the environment, it's important to cover that transformation of the human landscape that occurred with the 19th century rise of the factory system. Industrialization should be explored beyond just a British or European context as well. The spread of the factory system to the United States, Russia, and Japan represents an opportunity to see industrialization within a comparative context. So let's start with our first image here. What does this copper engraving show? Well, this copper engraving shows an early industrial town, and this is actually in Wales. Wood stacks stand amid the rubble and debris along a calm river or a canal. And at the heart of the city are cranes or conveyor belts, large buildings, and smokestacks. Farther up the hill above the city stands another plant with smokestacks, and this is a 19th century copper foundry. So what stands out the most and what seems the least important? Well, most dominant in this picture are the countless smokestacks. The dark smoke that's spewing into the sky and tightly packed around the city, but hardly noticeable, on the other hand, are the few human figures right there on the path above the riverbank. And these might be the workers or those that live in the town. So how did the artist feel about industrialization? What seemed to concern the artist in particular? Well, the artist must have been aghast at the way industrial development changed the landscape of Wales. This painting strongly emphasizes the thick soot, darkening the skies, the piles of debris, threatening to bury the small figures there in the front. And the artist not only laments the pollution of industrial development, but also the way these changes push human beings aside, making them seemingly insignificant. Okay, so as we look at explaining the Industrial Revolution, excuse me, Mahatma Gandhi criticized industrialization as economic exploitation. A few people have agreed with him. Every kind of society has embraced at least the idea of industrialization since it started in Great Britain in the late 18th century. And the Industrial Revolution was one of the most significant elements of Europe's modern transformation. in the initial industrial period. Sorry, I got interrupted there. Let's see. The initial industrialization period was 1750 to 1900, and they drew on the ideas of the scientific revolution. And it utterly transformed European society. It pushed Europe into a global, or a position of global dominance. And it was more fundamental than any breakthrough since the agricultural revolution. And we don't know where we are in the industrial era, at the beginning, the middle, or the end. That's an interesting question. Now, the origins of the Industrial Revolution lay in the population growth and an energy crisis. The development of non-renewable fossil fuels for energy was important, and mounting impact on the environment. Extractions of raw materials altered the landscape. Sewers emptied industrial waste into the environment, and smoke heavily polluted the air. And some voiced opposition to many of these. And for many historians, the Industrial Revolution ushered in the age of man, if you will, in human history. Now, the technology and science and economics elsewhere, when looking at the pre-industrial world, many would not see an inherent advantage for Europe. China arguably had the world's most impressive technology, and India and the Islamic world had made noteworthy accomplishments. Scientific and intellectual advances had impressed European travelers to these various Asian empires, and these societies were also enjoying strong commercial activity and long-distance trade networks that were noteworthy for both their volume and age. Thus, Europe was not predestined for power. So, why Europe? Right? Well, the Industrial Revolution brought enormous increases in the output of goods and services. In Britain, output increased some 50-fold in this 150-year period, 1750 to 1900. It was based on a culture of innovation. Now, before 1750 or about 1800, the major Eurasian civilizations were about equal technologically, as I was just explaining. And the greatest breakthrough was the steam engine. And soon this spread from the textile industry to many other types of production. And even agriculture was transformed. And so it spread from Britain to Western Europe, then the United States, Russia, and Japan. And in the 20th century, it finally became global. So it's almost like a competition within Europe. The inability to unite Europe in the millennium after the collapse of the Roman Empire was a long-term asset for European growth. With numerous smaller states locked in centuries of competition, a culture of constantly looking for an edge over one's rivals characterized European politics, hence the disunity of Europeans. This would lead to state support for innovation. In contrast, the Ottoman, Mughal, Safavid, and Chinese empires were much larger, and aside from the Ottoman and Safavid feud over Shia and Sunni interpretations of Islam, not exactly locked in a cycle of long-term competitive struggle with each other. So many scholars have debated why industrialization appeared first in Great Britain and why it started in the late 19th century. And some have argued that the features are unique of European society that explain the development beginning here. And that view has been challenged by the fact that other parts of the world have had times of great technological and scientific flourishing as well. And the fact that Europe did not enjoy any overall economic advantage as late as 1750. And the rapid spread of industrial techniques to much of the world in the past 250 years. So, and we also see state-merchant alliances, as these competitive states were in Europe were fairly young and grew out of the economic collapse of the post-Roman world. They were constantly trying to find new and secure sources of state revenue. Thus, the state frequently developed alliances with merchant groups who promised taxable income streams in return for state support, monopolies, and even military aid. Now, contemporary historians tend to see the Industrial Revolution as a rather quick and unexpected eruption in this period, 1750 to 1850, and why it might have occurred in Europe. Some patterns of internal development within Europe favored innovation, and European rulers, like I said, they had that unusual alliance with the merchant classes. And I say unusual, and that's compared to some of the other empires from around the world at this time, the Ottoman, Mughal, Safavid, and even the Chinese. And other societies developed these market-based economies by the by the 18th century, like Japan, India, and China. But Europe was at the center of the most varied exchange network. And contact with culturally different peoples encouraged change and encouraged innovation. And the Americas brought silver and raw materials and foods that the Europeans could use and exploit in order for those innovations and changes to take place. Okay, so let's look at our map. Okay, major industrial areas we see here in green. And we see the railroad lines by 1850. You can see it definitely exploded here in this 100-year period in Great Britain. And you can see the iron ore fields and coal fields all over Europe as they mined for fuel for the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so we've talked about why Europe. Now, why Britain? Britain was the most commercialized European country, especially of Europe's larger countries. Small farmers had relatively been pushed out due to the enclosure movement, and market production fueled by a number of agricultural innovations, also a large part of this. And the guilds that had developed during medieval Europe and into the Renaissance had largely disappeared. And the real supply of industrial workers was from Britain, and they didn't have many other options. British aristocrats were interested in commerce and the innovations and changes that came with commerce, hence money, and British commerce was worldwide. The political life in Great Britain encouraged commercialization and economic innovation. And this policy of religious toleration that essentially was established in 1688 welcomed people with technical skills regardless of their faith. The British government imposed tariffs to protect its businessmen, and it was easy to form companies and forbid workers' unions. And they unified the internal market thanks to the road and canal system. And the patent laws that they developed protected inventors' interests, and checks on the royal authority that had already previously been established through Parliament gave more room for private enterprise than to thus develop. Although the Industrial Revolution centered in Britain, it was not necessarily planned, and it unfolded in a rather spontaneous manner. Many would have predicted the reigning Northern Ireland Kingdom to become a world power, or would not have predicted this island to become a world power, but Britain did enjoy a few advantages, most of which became clear over time. Obviously, possessing a variety of American colonies provided access to the American windfall of food, profits. But Spain also had a large colonial empire, but was very late to industrialize. And importantly, Britain had a commercial society where landowners had pushed small tenant farmers out in favor of enclosed fields for livestock. Urban merchants thrived, and the aristocrats engaged in money-making entrepreneurial enterprises, unlike the French and the Spanish nobility who loathed merchant culture. On top of this, the British were religiously tolerant, welcoming many refugees from the continent, and they enjoyed a stable political system and rule of law as established by legal precedents, like I was explaining, that Parliament had already set in motion. And in such a political environment, owners of capital were willing to take risks and put their money towards the possibility of making money. And practical, not theoretical science. So unlike their continental colleagues in France and Britain and even with Germans, the British scholars engaged in practical observation of the world as opposed to theoretical debates. This meant that their scientific institutions were much more in tune with the needs of engineers. Now, also, there's this thing with lucky geography. While suffering from famously gloomy and wet weather, the British did enjoy a favorable geography. Water in the form of rain, rivers, canals, seaports, all provided natural transportation infrastructure. And furthermore, plentiful supplies of coal and iron were near each other, and Britain's island location freed it from the political instability and the military campaigns of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. So thus the emphasis on the scientific revolution was different in Great Britain. On the continent, logic and deduction and mathematical reason took up their theoretical debates, unlike Great Britain, like I explained earlier, where they applied science practically. In Britain, observation and experiment, measurement, mechanical devices, practical applications, all part of this initiative from the scientific revolution, and those ideas that engineers could use. And in Britain, the artisan and craftsman inventors were in close contact with scientists and entrepreneurs. And the British Royal Society, founded in 1660, took the role of promoting useful knowledge. Now, Britain had plenty of iron and ore, coal and iron ore, like I was explaining, and often conveniently located. And Britain was not devastated by the Napoleonic Wars, as Napoleon went traipsing through Europe, conquering lands left and right to the east and west, and even some to the south. Great Britain was not immune, but Great Britain didn't suffer direct invading from Napoleon, as opposed to other countries in Europe. And so they were behind the industrialization and innovation curve from Great Britain. And that also meant that social change in Great Britain was possible without a revolution. Obviously, we didn't see that happen in France. And that is the conclusion of explaining the Industrial Revolution. I will see you guys again for the first industrial society. We'll get into more depth with the British. See you then.